What's going on, guys? Welcome back. You may have noticed that a little while ago I put up a poll asking you guys whether or not you'd be interested in seeing me make another response video, similar to the one I did a year ago for the Cosmonaut Variety Hours breakdown of the Hobbit trilogy. Most of you seemed interested in seeing my response to Sheev Talks video on the Bad Batch Season 3, rather than my response to the Friendly Space Ninjas video on the Fantastic Beasts films. I'll probably do the Fantastic Beasts video eventually, but that one is a lot longer, this video is far shorter, and I think it makes for a more interesting topic of discussion, because if you didn't know, Sheev Talks is a fairly popular Star Wars YouTuber who makes in-depth analyses for almost all of the products that Disney has produced within the Star Wars franchise. And I actually love his content. His videos are extremely long, as you might be able to tell. Most of them are upwards of an hour, sometimes close to 3 hours, but that allows him to be comprehensive and explain all of his arguments in depth. I agree with him on almost everything. All the crappy shows like Ahsoka, Mandalorian, Boba Fett, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and even the Clone Wars. He made a nearly 5-hour analysis of the Clone Wars, talking about how it doesn't hold up. And despite the fact that I still like that show, I can't deny that he has a lot of valid arguments. However, the one thing I disagree with him on is the Bad Batch, because I think it's one of the best things Disney has made within Star Wars, but he clearly doesn't like it. He says that he finds it mediocre, but it's fairly obvious that he dislikes it, and I don't understand why. He's made 3 videos on it, and of all of them, this is by far the worst. As previously stated, a lot of his videos are long and comprehensive. This one is only 13 minutes and 22 seconds, meaning he doesn't have a lot of time to back up his arguments. Unfortunately, he doesn't do that, as we will find out very soon. So, without further ado, let's start this analysis, or response, to Sheev Talks' video on the Bad Batch Season 3, how it forgot to switch his laundry over, and now it smells weird.
Alright guys, I know how this is gonna sound, but I really didn't want to make another video about this show. For the last few weeks I've been really mulling that over, because I keep finding that I have a lot to say, but the passion just isn't there. It hasn't been for several years. However, the finale just about annoyed me enough that I think I have it in me for one more, so here goes. The Bad Batch...
Okay, so we have a problem right out of the gate. If you're not passionate about the show, then why make a short video where you don't validate a lot of your arguments, as we will see very soon. He hasn't really gotten to any of his main points yet, but I just want to say, that's a little weird. If you're not passionate and don't have that much to say, why make this video at all? Because I don't want to say it tarnished my opinion of him in any way, because I still enjoy his videos, but as far as his content goes, this is one of his few videos that I thought was just kind of bad. So, I don't know why he made it, if he admits right out of the gate that he didn't have a lot of passion for this project.
just wrapped up its 3rd season, and with that, it's limped its way to a predictably anticlimactic end. And now we all get to bear witness to the simpering conclusion of something that once held such promise. I should make it clear before I start this review that I don't think this show is bad. I never have. I've always maintained that it's a series riddled with mediocrity, which is especially frustrating given the mountains of potential that it has. Not only did it have the unique opportunity to explore the final days of the clone army following Revenge of the Sith, showing us where they ended up, how and why they were fizzled out, and how the clones were forced to cope with their lives without a war to fight. It also had the chance to really show us the beginnings of this new galactic empire that we've come to know so well, to show us a version of this regime in its infancy, and depict a world reacting to power changing hands. Fans of the show will tell you that it did all that, and they're not technically wrong. All of that subject matter is technically explored in this series, but that's kind of what I'm getting at here in this review. The Bad Batch is the textbook definition of a show that is technically a story. There are technical technically character beats and emotional payoffs, and some of them even technically go on arcs. But there's a very distinct artificiality.
This is just a weird point to me. Because, yeah, the show has all these elements. What's the problem with that? You haven't explained what this means? You're saying that it technically has these elements. Yes, it does. What's your issue with the show? He goes into this a little bit more shortly, but he still doesn't really explain what this point is of anything Disney Star Wars has produced, aside from Andor. Bad Batch is the only thing to have shown the Empire as a threat. We do see the transition from the Clone Wars, the conflict between the Republic and the Confederacy of Independent Systems. We see how it shifted from that into the Galactic Empire through the phasing out of the clones, the conscription of new soldiers. I think it does a great job on expanding on this point in the Star Wars timeline. It's just a great show as far as world building is concerned. I just don't understand his criticism here.
Artificiality that's plagued this show since the beginning and stuck with it all the way to its mediocre end. This is a show that's devoid of soul, that seems to be more interested in checking boxes for what ought to be included in the narrative rather than actually explore any of it meaningfully. It's as if these episodes were mass-produced on a conveyor belt and not a single human being was involved in the creation process at all. Does this all sound a bit harsh? Sure, I guess. I don't mean to be, and I'm sure there were plenty of people who worked on the show who definitely cared about what they were making. It just didn't show up in their work. Or hell, maybe
I strongly disagree with this, just from looking at interviews with Jennifer Corbett and Brad Rao, as well as the other writers involved, even the voice actors like D. Bradley Baker and Michelle Ang. It's clear that they were passionate about the story they were telling, and that's so refreshing after seeing so many fake interviews where the actors are trying to feign enthusiasm about a product that they clearly are just working on to have a line on their resume. I find it weird that he applies this point to the Bad Batch when it's one of, if not the only Disney Star Wars project to feel authentic and like the people involved in the creative process cared about the project they were making.
Giving them the benefit of the doubt, and each and every one of them only showed up for their paychecks. That's equally possible, and it would certainly explain the final product, but I suppose I should be good faith and assume there was actual passion behind the production of this series, unfortunately stifled by a distinct lack of creativity. I actually find it fascinating the way they managed to make 3 seasons of television without actually saying or doing anything. When it was announced that the
Whoa. Okay, let's slow down here for a second. The show doesn't do or say anything? Did you miss the whole message of the show about individuality, identity, fighting for your freedom, and to have freedom of choice and expression in a galaxy that is dominated by a tyrannical regime? The Bad Batch's fight for freedom and for a purpose in the galaxy. That's really what the show is about. Those are only the themes that I can think of off the top of my head, but there are many more to be analyzed throughout the show. You saying that the show doesn't explore any of these elements or that the show doesn't say anything isn't a valid point, because you haven't backed up that argument. He kind of loops back to this later on, but not really. Once again, he's not explaining anything so far, and a lot of this is highly subjective. If you didn't know, what he strives for is an objective approach to analyzing film, meaning that he just looks at the material as it is and tries to derive meaning from it. If he didn't derive meaning from this show, then that's fine. But that is a subjective take, and it feels weird that he's including it in this video when his whole memo is making videos that are highly objective.
coming third season would be the last, I was genuinely shocked because, to be honest, it really seemed like the show was just getting started. So little had happened by that point in the story that I figured they were setting up for a much longer show, some kind of story arc that would go on for multiple seasons, 5 or 6 at least. My theory was that they had so little story to actually tell that they were intentionally stretching it out as much as possible so they could keep it going, essentially on fumes. That would explain why they crammed in so many nothing burger episodes in between the small handful of actually plot-relevant ones, but it turns out they had so little story to tell.
I think people have a weird misconception about filler within a TV show, because I'd argue The Bad Batch doesn't have a lot of filler, because it's such a short series, only being 3 seasons, which is fairly short compared to most TV shows, even though a lot of Star Wars shows aren't very long. Most of them don't go past 1 season, like Book of Boba Fett, for example. But I don't think The Bad Batch has that much filler. He's acting like the show is mostly filler, with a few episodes thrown in to contribute to the overarching story. But the story, as previously stated, is about the Bad Batch fighting for independence, trying to forge their own identity in the galaxy and finding a new purpose outside of war. So a lot of the side missions and adventures they go on contribute to that journey. They get to see and experience different perspectives. One of my favorite smaller episodes throughout the show is when they help out Gungi the Wookiee youngling, or Padawan, on Kashyyyk, and they get to see a different culture's perspective on what is happening in the galaxy. Hunter trying to protect another young child, in a way trying to make up for what he was unable to do with Caleb Doom at the beginning of Season 1. It's a great episode, and a lot of people sleep on it. There are many more episodes like that. I'm just bringing that one up as an example. But I always find it weird when people apply the filler criticism to The Bad Batch, when in reality, the show doesn't have that much filler.
That even after all that, they could barely squeeze 3 seasons out of it. Or at least that's what I thought going into Season 3, but what I found most surprising by the last handful of episodes was that they continued to shove in substanceless filler episodes in the final stretch of the show, despite the fact that they had so much to wrap up.
Okay, what? There are substanceless filler episodes towards the end of the show. I don't understand this criticism. I don't want to compare this guy to Star Wars Theory, because he's a far better content creator than Star Wars Theory, who does a terrible job of explaining anything. Every one of his takes on Star Wars contradicts the other. But I remember looking at Star Wars Theory's reactions to Bad Batch Season 3 towards the end of the show, and him saying that episodes like Juggernaut and Into the Breach were filler, when they have clear story progression. The Bad Batch are finding a way to mount Tantus. That's what their mission has been for half of the show.
Barely any time to do that effectively. Omega was captured and taken back to the cloning facility, and I remember all the fans naturally assuming that we were gearing up towards some sort of multi-episode final arc of sorts. That from here on out, every single episode would be devoted to getting Omega back, and that we wouldn't have the Bad Batch dicking around on any more pointless side quests.
And that didn't happen.
The episode was literally called Point of No Return. And once again, I guess that is technically what happened. The next episode sees the Bad Batch going to bust former main antagonist Admiral Rampart out of an Imperial prison because they suspect he knows the coordinates to Tantus. But then after they spend an entire episode doing that, he tells them he doesn't actually know the coordinates, but he says he might know a way to circumvent that. So they then spend another entire episode getting the coordinates from an Imperial outpost. Then they get to Tantus, and they spend a whole episode running around the jungle trying to figure out a way in, while Omega works on her own escape plan from the inside, all just set up for the finale. Oh, and they fight a giant monster too, for good measure. We'd almost missed our quota there.
I don't even understand what your point is here. All you've done is explain what happens in the penultimate 3 episodes leading up to the finale. I don't see the problem with anything you just described. If anything, it reinforces how competent the Empire is in this show, because it's a difficult process for the Bad Batch to make it to Tantus. They don't just fly in magically the next episode after Omega gets captured. It's a long and arduous process. I commended the final few episodes for how intense they were, because the characters felt like they were in real danger. The ending of episode 13, Into the Breach, has one of my favorite moments in the show, as they latch onto a ship a millisecond before it jumps into hyperspace, barely making it in time.
You guys had 3 episodes between when Omega gets captured and the finale to progress the story more than an inch at a time, but instead they squandered them, and then the finale ended up resolving basically nothing other than the immediate plot. They get Omega, they free the clones, and they destroy the base. This most certainly felt like a season finale, but shoehorning in a final goodbye and a time jump in the last 5 minutes of the episode is not enough to conclude a show. Nor does this 50...
I strongly disagree with this point once again. He keeps bringing up this idea that the show technically hits the plot beats that it needs to hit without any real emotional impact behind them, but I and many other people feel that those plot beats were extremely well executed in the narrative. He says that they only move the story an inch at a time in the episodes leading up to the finale, but I don't see a problem with that. As previously stated, it reinforces how difficult it is to get to Tantus, how hidden it truly is. And what's the issue with the show taking time with the story? I will agree in a certain sense that the episodes leading up to the finale feel the least character-focused. There isn't a lot of deep character work going on in those episodes. They're mostly concerned with moving the plot forward. But that doesn't bother me, because I think they were still well executed. What's the problem with the show hitting plot beats if they're executed well?
Take any time to let the clone rebellion that they've ostensibly been building up to this entire show breathe. It happens and then it's over just as quickly. It's hard to adequately put into words just how lacking this all is, but I'm gonna try. You could have spent those 3 episodes...
Now, I feel people have a misconception about The Bad Batch, because the show was never building up to the clone rebellion. It isn't called The Clone Wars Part 2. It's called The Bad Batch. This finale and series was always concerned with telling a story about this small collective group of characters. It was less concerned with the clones overall and their grand plan to rebel against the Empire. Obviously, we had Rex in the background pulling these strings, bringing together these different clones, Echo and Emery joining him, but that was never the focus of the show. That's never what it was about, and I think a grand battle at the end with all the clones is a bit too much to ask from this show. That's never what it was about.
Having Omega escape and rallying the clone prisoners into fighting back, and then we could have had a multi-episode escape from this top-secret, highly secure base. You could have had the Bad Batch find the base within 1 episode of her capture, so that they and the clone network Rex and Echo set up could have played a part in the liberation of their brothers, essentially assaulting Tantus on 2 fronts and having a grand and epic battle that lives up to the concept of a clone rebellion. But the clone network doesn't even show up in this finale. I suppose they're setting all that up for some other show I don't plan to watch, because I say again that this really didn't feel like any kind of conclusion, just the final chapter of one specific part of a larger story of nothingness. But it's not lost on...
I don't know what to say to this. As I've already said, this show was never about the clone rebellion. It is about the clones, and connects back to the themes of identity and free will that the Clone Wars explored, but it was always about the Bad Batch, hence why the show is called that. It puts the pieces in place, with Rex forming a small rebellion, Senator Ryo Chuchi and Avi Singh clearly trying to work together behind the scenes. But that was never the focus of the show. If you didn't like the focus of the show, then that's fine. But holding this against the series feels strange, because that's never what its focus was. He also says that he doesn't care about whatever story they're making. He describes it as a story of nothingness. And if that's your opinion, then fine, man, but that's subjective. That's not objective. You can't hold that against the show, because that's not what the intent of the creators was.
Me that nothing was actually accomplished, really. The show prides itself on the fact that it's tying into the Mandoverse and the sequel trilogy by delving into the early stages of Project Necromancer, so even if destroying the cloning facility was a setback, it's nice to know that they really didn't do anything other than rescue Omega, and I gotta be honest, after the third or fourth time of that exact same plot, it gets kinda old. It also gets old watching...
I don't agree with this once again. I actually loved the finale because it felt conclusive in a franchise that has been full of series setting up the next series. For example, the Mandoverse being more concerned with interconnected MCU-style storytelling rather than actually telling a story. I loved that The Bad Batch had a conclusive ending where we got to see our characters live their lives after fighting for so long. On a thematic level, I think it was the perfect conclusion to the story. As far as the whole Palpatine cloning thing goes, I suppose they didn't affect much, but they did throw a wrench in the works. As we see in the sequels, Palpatine is a rotting zombie in a cave. Had they not destroyed Hemlock's research, Tantus, and recaptured Omega, then Palpatine would have been able to clone himself effectively, without any caveats. However, the project wasn't fully successful, meaning that the Bad Batch's actions did have some effect on Palpatine's grand plan. I also find it kind of silly that he criticizes the show for repeating the story beat of Omega getting captured, because the show is aware of how tropey that can be, and it mixes it up in each season, making it feel refreshing. I believe Wrecker even makes a remark about that in Season 3, how many times Omega's been captured, so it's nothing new for them. At least they're self-aware about it. But in Season 1, when Cad Bane captures Omega, it was a serious tonal shift. The characters didn't truly realize how much danger they were in, and their priorities shift after that point. They clearly become more protective of Omega after that point. At the end of Season 2, it's their worst fears being realized. Tech has died, and Omega gets captured. They've basically lost everything at that point. And the third time Omega gets captured, it's of her own volition. She chooses to surrender herself for the greater good, knowing that her brothers will be able to save her. Because of how much she trusts them, it's symbolic of her character growth. He's just applying a criticism to the show without elaborating on whether or not it's a problem. Because if you ask me, it isn't a problem. It's actually a strong point in the show. They're self-aware about it, and it serves a story purpose to show Omega's progression and development as a character.
Hunter, who's basically the main character despite having the personality of a wet sock, not develop or change at all across the entire series. He spends the first season trying to keep his head down from the Empire and sit out the fight, only to be reluctantly dragged in toward the finale. Then in Season 2, he wants to stay out of the fight and keep his head down, only to be reluctantly dragged back in toward the finale. And can you guess what his entire character was in Season 3? I mean, at the very least, I figured Tech being killed and Omega getting captured at the end of Season 2 might have finally jolted loose Hunter's willingness to fight the Empire head-on, but nope, they get her back, no thanks to him or Wrecker, by the way, and then he wants to keep his head down and stay out of the fight, only to be reluctantly dragged back in during the finale. And then, after all that, they go back to Pabu, and he spends the rest of his years sitting out the fight and avoiding the Empire, even urging Omega not to go when she wants to join the rebellion as an adult. There's no progression, he doesn't grow or develop. And listen, I have nothing against static characters when done well, but when he's the the main character who calls all the shots and all the other main characters follow him wherever he goes, you find yourself watching the show and realizing that across 3 seasons, zero progress has actually been made. It's been nothing but
This is wrong on so many levels. Hunter doesn't develop as a character? I think that that's a ridiculous statement. Hunter's character development is quite clear, but it's subtle. It's not grand development in the same way that a character like Crosshair is developed. I think a lot of people have a false idea about character development. Like, it has to be a huge shift in their morals or values. Hunter's general motives and his personal beliefs remain steadfast throughout the show, but he does change. Saying that he goes through the same arc in every season is blatantly incorrect. The only thing I'd say he's correct about here is that in Season 1, Hunter does largely sit out the fight and gets dragged in towards the finale. But he was reasonably afraid of the Empire, because they're a massive threat. It's him, 3 other dudes, and a kid. How is he going to fight against a massive galactic-scale regime? That's a reasonable concern. We see his values juxtaposed with that of Rex and Echo throughout the show, because Rex is a stalwart believer in the ideals of the Republic. He believes that since they're still here, they have a moral obligation to fight against evil, because that's what he believes in. It's not that Hunter isn't a noble character, but his concerns are purely about protecting his family, his squad, his own unit of guys. Plus, they have a kid with them, so he doesn't want to take the kid into danger. I don't see what the problem is with Hunter being skeptical about fighting the Empire. The other characters are more willing to fight and go out of their comfort zone, but as the leader of the group, all the heavy decision-making falls on him. It's his choice whether or not they go into these situations. At the end of Season 2, he isn't reluctantly dragged in. He discusses the plan with the team, and everyone else says, we gotta do this. We've gotta go in and try to help Crosshair. Despite Hunter protesting against them doing that, he ultimately makes that call as the leader. A decision which leads to Tech's death. As Wrecker says in Season 3, Tech knew the risks, but Hunter feels personally responsible for Tech's death. We can see that purely through the animation of his mannerisms and facial expressions. He clearly feels terrible about what happened to Tech. Leaving Crosshair behind at the beginning of the first season was a difficult choice for him to make. He feels bad about that, something that is only exacerbated when Crosshair calls him out for leaving him behind, despite that being against the ideals of their squad. I think Hunter is a great character. Clearly what he's missing at the end of Season 3 is that Hunter has changed. He doesn't just protest against Omega going off to fight the Empire. He's willing to let her go. He does say he wants to protect her, but he accepts her decision because he respects her as a person. He's seen her growth personally, and he knows that he can't protect her anymore. It's her choice, and he respects that. The Hunter we knew as far back as Season 1 would not have been willing to let Omega go off on her own to fight the Empire. That is indicative of his character growth. One of my favorite moments in Season 3 is towards the end of Episode 13, where Rampart tells him to call off the mission, to abort because it's too risky. They're probably gonna die. It's more than likely. There is a 1% chance they will succeed. And Hunter says, negative, and goes headfirst into danger, knowing they probably won't survive, but they have to take that risk to try and help Omega. I don't understand how you can look at that and say that he's reluctantly dragged back in when he made the conscious choice to do that. He is the leader. He makes the decisions. So he isn't reluctantly dragged around by everyone else. He made the choice to do that. In Season 3, we see that he's involved in Rex's network of clones, something he was a little bit reserved about in the previous 2 seasons. When Rex called on their help in Seasons 1 and 2, he would tell Rex, "That's a big ask. I don't know if it's worth the risk." But by the time we get to Season 3, we see that he's actively participating in this conflict because he knows there's nothing else he can do. He can't avoid the fight anymore because it's taken too much from him. There's so much wrong with his argument. Hopefully, I explained that fairly in depth there. There's more I could say about this, but saying that Hunter doesn't develop as a character is wrong on so many levels.
Side quests for 3 years, and I have no idea why more people don't have a problem with that. I should mention that I don't actually have any issue with filler episodes like some are gonna claim, but people like to defend them here by saying things like they develop the characters, when they really, really don't. Hunter gets none, and to say that Wrecker gets any is laughable, since he hasn't been relevant since Season 1.
Okay, that's just blatantly incorrect once again. There's literally an episode in Season 3, the second episode, about Hunter and Wrecker on their own following the loss of Tech. We see how they're grieving, but trying to move forward. Hunter is more reckless. He wants to go into danger, and Wrecker has to be the one to tell him that they need to take a step back and reassess. That shows that Wrecker has developed. He used to be more reckless, for lack of a better word, but now he's the one cautioning Hunter on how reckless his actions are. That entire episode is about Hunter and Wrecker helping these young clones, giving them choice. Once again, choice is the theme of the show. They give these children the option to find a new path, similar to how they have through their journey over the course of the show. If that isn't indicative of character development, I don't know what is. I will concede that Wrecker is by far the most static character in the show, but I still think he's a good character. Similar to Hunter, his development is more subtle. It isn't grand on the scale that it is for Crosshair, but it is there. That small moment of Wrecker telling Hunter that the last time they went into an Imperial base, not all of them made it out. That's something that Wrecker would not have said in the previous seasons, but the losses that they've suffered have changed them.
Remains at large. The only characters who get any development are Omega and Crosshair, and even then, it's really minimal. Yes, I'm afraid I still haven't changed my stance on Crosshair, despite the efforts of many in my comment sections trying to convince me that this is an L take from me. I'm sorry, he's just not well written. I've explained it in 2 different videos now, and still have yet to hear a sufficient counter to any of my points. No, it is not valid to say that Crosshair, having removed his chip while remaining in service to the Empire, is more interesting than if he'd simply been brainwashed, because we're talking about what makes sense for the character, not what you personally find more interesting. And no,
Okay, so to give you a bit of context, he doesn't explain a lot in this video as to why he dislikes Crosshair's character. He has gone a little bit more in depth on that in previous videos, but essentially his argument is that Crosshair's obedience to the Empire, his willingness to follow orders at any cost, stands in contradiction to his actions in the Clone Wars, where we are clearly told the Bad Batch have never been on board with following orders or doing what is regulated by the Republic. They're kind of their own rogue entity, and Crosshair went along with that until the inhibitor chip took over his brain. But even after that point, he still remains loyal to the Empire. He takes issue with the fact that Crosshair doesn't oppose the Empire because of everything it's taken away from him. But what I feel is important to understand about Crosshair is, unlike the rest of the Bad Batch, his special ability, being an expert sniper, is something that can't be employed outside of warfare. He feels purposeless without a war or a government to serve. He wants to continue fighting, just like many of the clones do, but eventually he realizes that he can have purpose outside of that, outside of serving a larger entity. He can be a brother, a member of a family. That's his entire journey.
Doesn't make sense for his character like many want to claim, which is the entire reason I took issue with it in the first place. On that front though, I did actually find it interesting how one of the arguments I received in my Crosshair video last year actually ended up retroactively making it into the canon. Some argue that the reason Crosshair stayed with the Empire was because he was devoted to being a good soldier, and figured that was the best way to go about doing that, and I of course wrote that off as writing the script for the writers, since that goes against everything we understood about his character before the inhibitor chip, and it was never actually mentioned in the show. But there actually was a scene this season that tried to use that explanation, so hey, maybe you guys were onto something.
I thought I was being a good soldier.
I mean, it still doesn't make any...
Once again, Crosshair felt purposeless without a system to serve. We barely knew anything about him prior to the Bad Batch. He was given minimal characterization in the Clone Wars. So I personally don't have a problem with them changing aspects of his character to suit the story they're telling now. That is a subjective take. That's not an objective analysis of the show. But I don't have a problem with them making minor tweaks to Crosshair's characterization if it benefits the story as a whole. Crosshair was trying to be a good soldier. He felt purposeless. He needed to fight because his special ability is something that cannot be used outside of warfare. Obviously, he saw what the Empire was capable of, but we were shown from the beginning of the show that Crosshair internalizes things on a personal level. His entire argument against the Bad Batch at the end of the first season is that they left him behind. He says they weren't loyal to him when he was actively trying to kill them previously. He's a hypocrite, essentially, at that point in the story, because what were they supposed to do? Bring you with them so you can stab them in the back at a later date? He takes things extremely personally, but when it comes to the atrocities the Empire commits on a galactic level, he's kind of desensitized to it. We see that at the end of Season 1, when Hunter tells him that the Empire destroyed an entire city with him in it. They didn't give a shit whether he lived or died, and Crosshair says they did what needed to be done. It's not until Mayday, someone he's formed a bond with, the only person left in his life who cared about him, who saved his life twice, is discarded like a piece of garbage by one of the most rotting, disgusting characters we've ever seen affiliated with the Empire, that he snaps and changes his allegiances, because at that point it's clear no matter what he does, they'll never value him. It required something truly personal, essentially himself, a clone. They're all clones, one of his brothers, someone the same as him, dying right before his very eyes when he could have been helped. That is what changed him. It was something truly personal, because that's what we've seen. Crosshair takes things personally. He doesn't care if some person gets killed on a mission, because that's what he had to do. He had to kill the Senator in Season 2. He had to kill Saw Gerrera's rebels, even though they were innocent people, you know? Because he was following orders. It was part of the mission. But when someone he had grown close to, someone he cared about, was essentially left out for dead to get picked by the ice vultures, that changed his mind. And I don't see a problem with that. It feels realistic. It doesn't feel like it's a script forcing the character to make a decision. Crosshair feels like such a real character because his decisions are authentic. That's the same for many of us. Many of us don't realize that something goes against our morals until it crosses a very personal line, and that's how it played out for Crosshair. The guy's been through so frickin' much. He got his brain taken over by an inhibitor chip. He got his brain fried by an engine. So his brain probably isn't even functioning properly anyway, but his values are consistent throughout the show. As he says in season 3, he values loyalty. And he was given loyalty by his squad. He was shown loyalty from Omega, and that's why he cares about her. The Empire showed him when they let Mayday die on the tarmac that they didn't value his loyalty, and by extension, they would not be loyal to him. They never had his back, but Mayday, the Bad Batch, Omega, they always did.
And even if it did, it's a little fucking late, guys, but yeah, I guess there it is. So here's what they decide to do with Crosshair this season. He and Omega break out of prison, they reunite with the Bad Batch. There's a bit of tension between him and Hunter, as you'd expect, though none from Wrecker, because he's even less of a character than Hunter somehow. And what little tension there is between Hunter and Crosshair gets resolved anticlimactically within one episode, after yet another obligatory big monster fight and a stale, meaningless conversation.
Okay, let's talk about that for a second. Whew, that's a hot take. How can you possibly call this a stale, meaningless conversation? This is arguably one of the most emotionally powerful moments in the entire show. It's Crosshair finally acknowledging what he's done wrong, admitting his mistakes to Hunter, someone he has actively antagonized and called a bad leader since the very beginning of the show. He has stood in opposition to Hunter for this entire story. This is where the real personal conflict lies between these two. I don't take that much issue with the fact that Wrecker and Echo forgave Crosshair more quickly because, well, Echo wasn't with the Bad Batch for that long, so he didn't have that much of a personal connection to Crosshair. We also saw that Wrecker and Crosshair's relationship was more related to their little rivalry over how many droids they took out in Clone Wars Season 7. They have strong camaraderie, but they didn't have a deeply personal connection like Crosshair and Hunter. Hunter felt personally betrayed by Crosshair. Not only did he actively try to kill him several times, but he did antagonize him. He called him a bad leader, said he wasn't fit to lead the squad. So Hunter is obviously gonna have some issues with him. And this scene doesn't even fully resolve all of the tension between them. What they say in this scene is acknowledging their mistakes and moving on, but these wounds between the two of them will probably never be fully healed. Hunter tells Crosshair that he has regrets, but all they can do is keep trying to be better, and there might be hope for them yet. He isn't saying he forgives Crosshair for everything he's done to them. He's just saying that, similar to Crosshair, he's made mistakes, he has regrets, but they can still try and move on. I think this is an incredibly powerful and important conversation between these two characters. Calling it stale and meaningless is wrong on so many levels. As I've talked about, this guy has a weird perspective on Hunter as a character. He acts like he has zero nuance or development over the course of the show. But I'd argue the relationship between Hunter and Crosshair is the heart of it just as much as Omega is the heart of the story, because these two have been at odds from the very beginning. Finally seeing them work through their differences and accept their past mistakes was absolutely incredible. This is my favorite episode of the season and possibly of the entire show. We're also shown earlier in the episode Hunter watching Crosshair paying respect to Mayday and his other fallen friends who he served alongside at the outpost. Hunter doesn't know exactly what happened to Crosshair, but he can see just from his actions that he has changed. And I think that's important as well. Hunter can tell how Crosshair has changed, whether or not he knows or even saw what led to that change.
Up that Crosshair has some kind of PTSD that's causing his hand to shake, which ends up fucking with his ability to aim properly. You know, the one thing he's actually good at. Now, in the episode where Omega gets captured, what happens is the Empire figure out the Bad Batch live on this island, so they invade the place, take all the civilians hostage, and Omega decides to give herself up to protect them. At the time, the only one who's with her is Crosshair, and when she tells him the plan, he rightfully says it's crazy, before eventually going along with it because he's a fucking idiot. Her initial plan is to fix herself with a tracker so that once she gets to Tantus, the others will be able to follow her coordinates, but Crosshair realizes why that obviously won't work.
They'll search you and find it. It won't work.
She then hatches the ingenious idea of him shooting the tracker onto the ship she's on and following that to Tantus. I guess we're just ignoring the fact that ships have ways of detecting that sort of thing, so alright, yep, I guess that's what we're doing.
Now, I looked up whether or not this is true, and I couldn't find any resources that prove this to be correct. I'm gonna give him some leeway on this one because I'm not sure. Perhaps he's going on the logic established in the sequel trilogy that the First Order can track ships through hyperspace, but I prefer to completely ignore the rules that those films established because they contradict everything established in the original trilogy and the rest of the Star Wars story, but I don't really know what to say to this. I don't think there's a way that people can detect trackers. He just showed a clip of Obi-Wan throwing a tracker onto the Slave One in Attack of the Clones, and I'm pretty sure Jango Fett didn't know that Obi-Wan had tracked him to Geonosis, unless I'm forgetting something, so this feels like a strange point to bring up.
Cool. Now, I just mentioned how Crosshair has been having these tremors that are affecting his aim, so naturally you'd assume that was being set up so that in this critical moment where he needs to shoot the tracker onto the ship, he misses. That would be especially poignant since it would mean that he failed one of the only people who cared about him despite all he'd done by fumbling the one thing that's supposed to be his thing. And then the payoff in the final episode could have something to do with him saving her by overcoming this impediment. A nice thematic through line that resonates well with the character. So do you want to know what actually happens instead? Well, he gets into position to shoot the tracker onto the ship, but then he gets attacked by a bunch of stormtroopers, so by the time he's dealt with them and manages to fire the shot, it's too late. The ship takes off, and the tracker falls right into the water. He failed Omega, but not because of any interpersonal character reasons. He just got unlucky. Could happen to anyone, really. And then it gets even funnier.
Now, that isn't entirely true. Crosshair did fail Omega for interpersonal character reasons, because he's afraid. Not only does he have PTSD, which is causing his hand to tremor, he's also afraid of losing his family. As we've established, Crosshair is a character who takes things very personally. He deeply cares about the Bad Batch now that he's reconnected with them, and Omega in particular, so he's afraid of losing them. He lost everything else. He lost his friend Mayday. Commander Cody left him. He was isolated for so long. Now he's finally got his family back. He doesn't want to lose them again, so he is afraid. Regardless of the fact that the stormtroopers interfered, the old Crosshair would have been able to make that shot regardless of outside interference, because we saw how frickin' awesome he was at aiming and shooting. He was an expert sniper. But he's afraid, and that causes him to be unstable and miss.
Because the next episode starts with Hunter and Wrecker having already found out about this off-screen, and they apparently just don't give a fuck. They should be fucking pissed at this dude. Why don't we even get to see their reactions? You know, for a show that supposedly has so many filler episodes so they can develop the characters, the series seems to be absolutely allergic to character drama.
Okay. This is, once again, a point that I don't understand. It would not make sense in this situation for the Bad Batch to remain mad at Crosshair. As established in Episode 5, they may not have completely forgiven him, but due to the severity of the situation, they have accepted him, and they trust him to some extent. They know how determined Omega gets, and Crosshair would not have been able to stop her, no matter how hard he tried. So, they would have no reason to be mad at him. Why should they be mad at Crosshair in this situation? At this point, their main focus is getting Omega back. It would be a waste of time for them to bicker among themselves when they could be working towards an alternative solution. We do even see some conflict in this scene when Wrecker becomes clearly agitated towards Crosshair after he admits to knowing about an alternative way of getting to Tantus. So there is character conflict, but it doesn't take precedence because they've settled their differences with Crosshair at this point in the story. As previously stated, it would be a waste of time for both the audience and the characters for them to fight in this scene. I don't understand this criticism at all.
Oh, and by the way they resolve the whole Crosshair trimmer thing is they just cut his hand off and then it's over. That's how it. They don't have him overcome it, or any kind of resolution to an arc. It's just having trimmers in your hand. Fucking cut it off. The best way.
Acting like Crosshair didn't have a resolution to his character arc is simply untrue. Did you miss the whole scene where he makes the pivotal shot to save Omega from Hemlock on the catwalk over a giant ravine? That was the key moment in Crosshair's character arc. Sure, at that point his hand was gone, but his trauma wasn't the only thing affecting him. Yes, his hand tremors were the physical manifestation of his internalized trauma, what he went through with Mayday and his time spent with the Empire, as well as the torture he endured on Mount Tantus. But he's also afraid, as previously stated. He fears losing his family. We see that in a scene earlier in the finale episode where he tells Hunter and Wrecker to go back while he infiltrates the base alone. He's essentially willing to give his life if it means they will live. That's something very important to him. At that point, the Bad Batch, his brothers, are all he has left. And that moment on the catwalk when he's able to make the shot that destroys the binders connecting Hemlock to Omega and he and Hunter blast Hemlock off the bridge, that was his moment. Regardless of the fact that he had lost his hand prior to that, he needed to overcome those fears. And in that moment, Hunter tells him that Omega knows what to do. He can make the shot if he waits for her. In that moment, everything falls on him, and he's reassured by Hunter, the person he had the most personal conflict with. But if anything, that's a sign, the biggest sign we've gotten, that Hunter has forgiven Crosshair and does trust him. He already knew that Omega trusted him, but he needed Hunter's reassurance. With that, he's able to overcome his fears of losing his family and that he doesn't have a place with this squad anymore. In that moment, it is affirmed to him that he does have a place with them. The Bad Batch are his family. They do view him that way. He overcomes all of these internal fears in that moment. His trauma and PTSD wasn't the only part of his character. I don't know why this guy has trouble understanding that.
I can describe the Bad Batch is that it's like cotton candy, or daddy's beard if you're a fucking weirdo. It's pretty and it looks like a lot, but once you take a bite, it starts to dissolve in your mouth and you realize there really isn't much there. If you were hungry before you ate the cotton candy, you're gonna be hungry after, because it doesn't really provide you with any sustenance. But despite this, there are people who really like it. It's nice and sugary, and in the moment, it can give you that rush you so desperately crave. It doesn't matter to them if there's no real lasting effect, because they had a good time, and that's all they seem to be looking for.
This is how I would describe every other Disney Plus Star Wars show. All the live action ones, the Mandoverse, that's how I describe them. They're all cotton candy. People liked Mando seasons 1 and 2, which are actually bad, because they had fun cameos and dumb action that made no sense. But The Bad Batch is a show with substance. It has subtext which can be analyzed. I watched seasons 1 and 2 of the show with my friend earlier this year who hadn't gotten around to watching them previously, and we would have hour-long discussions after the fact about the different themes present in the story. We love talking about it. When I watch something like Ahsoka, I can't do that, because there is no substance. It is fluffy and meaningless. There is no meaning. There's no subtext. But The Bad Batch has that. Just because you didn't pick up on it doesn't make it a problem with the show.
There's nothing more emblematic of that than the fact that there were a lot of Bad Batch fans desperately praying Tech would be revealed to be alive, despite his death being one of the only semi-meaningful moments in the whole show. Because they don't actually care if it tarnishes the stakes or the emotional impact, they just want to see the character they like again, that's all. To that end,
I do agree that is a recurring problem I've seen. I don't know why people wanted Tech to come back. I was hoping and praying all throughout Season 3 they wouldn't pull off some stupid reveal where Tech was the brainwashed clone assassin guy. Thank God they didn't do that. The show had permanent stakes, something that no other Star Wars show has had outside of Andor. I do disagree that Tech's death is the only semi-meaningful moment in the show, because it's not. There are plenty more, including the conversation between Hunter and Crosshair, but according to him, it's stale and meaningless. He never elaborated on what he meant by that, but, you know, no, there's no weight to any of it. That's the thing. The Bad Batch, to me, had weight as a story. Characters' decisions had consequences, and they were treated with realism. Looping back to the idea that there's no character conflict in the show, if that were the case, we wouldn't have gotten an entire episode of Hunter and Crosshair reconciling and working things out. Compare that to Ahsoka, where Sabine makes an incredibly reckless decision of exposing the entire galaxy to Thrawn's wrath just so she can see Ezra again. When she sees Ezra and Ahsoka again, no one calls her out on that. The show actively avoids conflict, but The Bad Batch doesn't. If there were no conflict in this show, then The Bad Batch would have immediately forgiven Crosshair, but they didn't. It took an entire episode, and even after that, they didn't fully forgive him. They were able to accept him back, but as previously stated, the wounds there will never fully be healed.
That a lot of people like this show. I really do. And I don't expect to change anyone's mind on it. There have been plenty in my own follower base who keep making sure to let me know that I'm wrong about The Bad Batch, and I wish I was, but it's just not a very good show. It's 3 seasons of very little plot, character, or theme to speak of, polished just enough to make it seem like there might actually be substance beneath the surface. As an overall product,
you haven't proven that throughout this video. You haven't proven
the level of
that
bad,
the show has no substance, because it does. It's a great story. There are consequences. The characters do grow and change. Their choices are treated with realism. Crosshair is one of the most realistic characters I think I've ever seen in the Star Wars franchise, because his actions have weight. But no, there's no theme, there's nothing. There's no value to the show, is essentially what he's telling you in this video. But, as you may have noticed, he hasn't proven that. At no point throughout this video does he expand on his points. He says these things, like the fact that there's no character conflict. He describes Hunter and Crosshair's interaction as being stale and meaningless. He says there's no deeper meaning, there's no themes. There is no subtext to be analyzed, but he hasn't proven that. At no point does he actually explain his arguments in this video.
It was so unambitious throughout its entire run that it never did anything to push the envelope in either direction or take any risks. So it sits comfortably in its mediocrity and manages to be the least offensive Star Wars project we've gotten in the last several years, barring Andor, of course. It's a 4 out of 10. Bye.
Okay, it's definitely better than a 4 out of 10. That's way too low for this show. And what do you mean the show didn't push any boundaries? It didn't take any risks. You just pointed out that Tech died. That's a pretty major risk, if you ask me. They had the guts to kill off a main character that a lot of people grew to care about. I've seen people point out the fact that Tech is in many ways representative of autistic people, or people that struggle with different mental challenges, and I think that's great. I'm glad the show provides representation in that regard. Killing him off was a major risk, especially when he was building relationships. That's what makes his death so tragic. The fact that he was starting to build a relationship with Fee. He was starting to open up and become more social. He was starting to change as a person. He was growing, and that was cut short due to tragedy. But he made a selfless choice. He gave his life so the rest of his brothers could live on. And by the end of the show, that's what they do. They're able to achieve peace and live their lives away from the conflict. They get to choose what they want to be. It's what the whole show was about, and yet it has no meaning. It's devoid of soul, as he said at the beginning of this video. Did he explain that, though? Did he substantiate that claim, that the show's devoid of soul, that it's meaningless? He didn't. He made a bunch of points that don't hold up under the slightest bit of scrutiny when you apply any critical thinking to this video. If you take all of his points at a surface level, they seem to be correct. You know, it seems like, yeah, maybe he's got a point there. Maybe it's true that they cut off Crosshair's hand before they concluded his arc. But that isn't true, because there were countless elements at play that he chose not to acknowledge. It feels like he's being ignorant in this video. There's no other way to put it. He's decided that he dislikes this show and will die on that hill, even if he doesn't have any valid reasons for feeling that way. This is a disappointing video, in my opinion, because, as I've stated previously, Sheev Talks is a great YouTube channel. I would highly recommend checking him out, because most of his content is great. I love his analyses for all of these different shows and movies, but he chose to apply a subjective lens to this show. He was unable to take off the tainted glasses he was wearing and view this show objectively. Because none of this video is objective criticism. All of it is his subjective take on the show. If he doesn't like it, that's fine. He can just say that. But the way he phrased himself earlier, saying that he wishes he was wrong, but he's not, because the show isn't good. It feels like he's trying to insinuate that he's superior to the audience in some way, because he is provably correct. He's right about this show. It isn't good. It has no meaning. But that isn't true. If you actually watch the show and you analyze it like I have, I've given a lot of thought to the story, and I've analyzed it. There's a lot to take away from it. There are probably themes present in the story that I didn't even talk about in this video or my countless other videos on the show, but he chose to ignore them. He's just choosing to be ignorant in this video. He's choosing not to acknowledge the merits of the show, and that's not great for someone who claims to strive towards objectivity. Because all this video was him spewing out invalid complaints about a show that he clearly didn't bother to analyze or think about beyond a surface level. And that's pretty much all I have to say about this video. The video is over. He's done with his poorly explained points about The Bad Batch Season 3. I thought this would be a fun video because, as you all know, I love The Bad Batch, and I think a lot of people do. You can see that just from my comment sections. A lot of people love this show, so there is an audience for it. However, there are always going to be people that dislike these shows. I think that Sheev, I don't even know his real name, that's just what he calls himself, has been burned so badly by these other terrible Star Wars shows that he is incapable, or at least unwilling, to acknowledge the merits of this one. But I'm not. He loves Andor. I love Andor too. But you can still give a show credit for doing things well. I don't think The Bad Batch is a perfect show. Absolutely not. But it does a lot of things well, and acting like it doesn't try to do anything and doesn't succeed at anything is so wrong, and I wanted to point that out in this video. I don't know what the chances are that Sheev will actually watch this video. I know he has responded to other people's videos in the past, so if he does respond to my video, that'll be really cool. And if you're watching this video, man, I'd love to talk with you sometime about The Bad Batch. Because I think had he bothered to go more in-depth in this video, make this a 40-minute to hour-long analysis, it would have been fairly comprehensive, and I would have understood what he was trying to say. Perhaps I would have agreed with some of his points, but because the video is so short, he didn't explain anything. So I don't have much to respond to, if you get what I'm saying, because so much of it is subjective, and all I can do is disprove his points with the facts, and I feel like I've done that throughout this video. But with all that being said, that's it for my response to Sheev Talks' video on The Bad Batch Season 3. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, because I certainly enjoyed making it. Videos like this are a useful exercise in my own analytical and critical thinking skills. I like to respond to other people's videos and see what points they have that hold up and some that don't. I don't think there were any truly good arguments in this video, at least none that he bothered to substantiate. And if I ever get a chance to talk to him, I love to have a fun, civil debate. That's something that I love about his content, is that he always strives to be very civil and understanding in his videos. He likes to hear everyone out. He doesn't try to shout people down, which is something you don't see a lot on YouTube. So if you haven't seen any of his videos, I would highly recommend checking out this guy's channel. I love most of his videos. This just happens to be a rare case where I disagree with him. But you guys let me know. What are your thoughts on this video in the comments below? Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with Sheev? Do you agree with Sheev and disagree with me? Just whatever your thoughts are. Please let me know them all in the comments below. And of course, as always, I hope you guys have a great day. Take care.